Due Process, honored for 3 consecutive years with the Mid-Atlantic Emmy for Outstanding Talk Program Series.
Call. Office. Calling.
Will cell phones on the road be banned? Will parents have the right to know when a teenager wants an abortion? And are we really making progress when it comes to racial profiling? Just 3 of the stories from this Due Process season. Just 3 of the stories we update now on this special edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual.
Every week here on Due Process, we take on a current issue of law and social justice. Usually it's an issue in flux, unresolved, next step pending.
And so near the end of each season, we take the opportunity to look back at where we've been, update some of our stories, and make some educated guess as to where they're headed next.
So on this edition, our once-a-year retrospective, I'm Raymond Brown.
And I'm Sandra King, and we start our annual update with the story that may have been the year's most likely to encounter the reaction, "You have got to be kidding."
It seems that most of our viewers, and maybe most New Jerseyans, just assumed that any procedure so invasive and permanent and potentially dangerous would be controlled by a detailed set of state laws and standards and rules.
So our report that tattooing and body piercing remains totally unregulated here in New Jersey brought an unusual share of viewer shock, even from those who've been tattooed or pierced by artists they assumed were licensed. Once you've got one, it is yours for life. Like it.
I'm thinking long and hard when I got this one too.
Too late now.
Too late.
Or not.
Grateful Dead bear. I regret the 2 of them.
So who's allowed to get a tattoo? By New Jersey state law, it can be anyone who wants one. How old were you when you got your first one?
I was 15 and I was stupid and I went to the first person that would tattoo me without asking for an ID.
And who's allowed to make these permanent marks? Virtually anyone who has a mind to.
The problem is you can just buy a tattoo kit and a piercing kit. You can buy it from the tattoo magazine, send for it, and then you can set up a business. So that's dangerous.
And so Assemblywoman Kreco introduced state legislation to license those who pierce and tattoo while providing that their underage clients have parental permission before they can be tattooed or pierced.
Now, you may have thought, as we did, that support for those bills would fall somewhere between apple pie and motherhood. But, Raymond, so far, those regulations have had no success.
Sandy, we were surprised at the beginning to find no regulations, surprised that no movement has taken place?
Well, in fact, particularly surprised since 2 years ago, both houses enthusiastically passed these measures. The governor, Christy Whitman at the time, said no. She thought that 14 was a more appropriate age of consent than 18. It looked like it would simply go back, do another round, particularly once she was gone. No problem. Hasn't turned out that way.
When legislation gets stuck in molasses, we're not shocked, but this is an issue that is surprisingly serious. Dr. McCampbell, who was our guest, said that he saw a case involving AIDS from piercing that was done without regulation, and he talked about hepatitis B and other very serious disease.
What Dr. McCampbell had to say was so frightening that it makes you wonder whether we're going to see some major tragedy in this state on tattooing and piercing before we see some movement on the legislation.
Sad, but perhaps prophetic. Our tattoo show was different from some of what we do in that it had potential impact on large numbers of ordinary people.
But if the numbers are big for those getting tattoos, they don't begin to compare to the numbers using cell phones. We are all using them all the time, even when we are behind the wheel. And in the last 6 months, we've seen a slew of new laws and proposed laws here and around around the country. But when we did our cell phone safety show, only little Marlboro Township had taken a stand against dialing while driving.
Public enemy number one, drivers on cell phones.
Okay, that's just a commercial. So the cell phone won't land us on the most wanted list, but it may not be doing much for the way we drive.
Meanwhile, you're swerving all over the road.
Sure, it's revolutionized the way we stay in touch, and it's given walking a whole new step. But it's the cell phone on the road, the chat behind the wheel, that has set alarms ringing. At least in some quarters.
I said, you know, this is an issue that I think I need to bring forward to my colleagues in Marlboro Township so we can talk about it, because I felt it was an important safety issue.
So Little Marlboro Township became the first in New Jersey to make a legal call against cell phones.
All it is a quick second it takes and an accident and somebody could get hurt, and I don't think it's worth it.
It was a point-driven home when a 2-year-old Pennsylvania girl was killed in a crash. A cell phone-using driver ran a stop sign.
And it's stories like that one that have fueled the drive to get cell phones off the road in New Jersey and across the country. Since we first did our show, there's been legislation proposed in Trenton, in New York, in a score of other states, and in the United States Senate by New Jersey's John Corzine.
There are folks that are losing their lives regularly by dialing while trying to drive, or at least certainly causing disruptions in traffic. And I feel like it's a serious problem. I think American people do. I think people in New Jersey do.
Sandy, it's interesting that this issue is like the piercing issue in an intriguing kind of way. Both at first blush seem to be instances where the legislature is infringing in a way that involves a nuisance to us. But then you think about the serious consequences, both in the piercing cases and also with these cell phones, and then you realize it's a very serious issue.
And in fact, Raymond, when you reach that point, you say, well, here's another apple pie issue. Why isn't it just sailing through? And yet here we have our cell phone legislation in New Jersey, at this point still stuck in a committee. Presumably the same thing could be happening on the congressional level, and it makes you wonder what's going on.
Well, on the one hand, Sandy, I'm sure there are people who argue that there's serious liberty interests being infringed by the legislation, but we also have the reality of corporate involvement. In the United States Senate in particular, we've read that it looks like corporations who have an economic interest in cell phones are lining up to oppose potential legislation that gives it a slightly different cast.
Well, and I think that the public is moving on this issue, even if the legislators are hanging a little bit behind. The shocking story of supermodel Nikki Taylor being in a terrible car accident, almost dying because the driver of the car she was in admits he looked down to answer his cell phone.
It looks like there may be another parallel, and this is the tragic one, that it may require some dramatic incident or incidents like Nikki Taylor, as with piercing, before the Congress or the state legislatures really get moving.
And Raymond, whether it is principle or profit, there are strong feelings on both sides of the cell phone question, but nothing like the high emotions that surround another of the issues we focused on this year, whether parents should be told when their underage daughters seek an abortion. Last year, when the state Supreme Court overturned a new law requiring parental notification, pro-choice forces called it a victory, while opponents were vowing to pass a new law amending the state constitution and therefore bypassing the court scrutiny.
The undisputed evidence in this case shows that the Parental Notification for Abortion Act will harm New Jersey teenagers and violate their rights to privacy and equal protection as guaranteed by the New Jersey Constitution.
When the legislature determined to enact this law, it didn't have to guess as to what constitutional standards it would have to include in its law, what requirements its law would have to have in order to be upheld should there be a constitutional challenge. And it didn't have to invent any new or novel legal arguments to support this law.
But the so-called Whitman Court defied the governor when it struck down parental notification as a violation of the state constitution's Equal Protection Clause.
We believe that as young women, we have the right to safe and effective health care. We believe that as young women, we have the right to choose to terminate a pregnancy. And we know that the information is available to us to make that decision ourselves.
But furious legislative leaders and anti-abortion activists were not prepared to let it rest.
This is wrong. It is something that this state's populace realizes should be a part of New Jersey life. Parents being helped by the state to be involved in these kind of decisions by young children.
Their next move, a constitutional amendment, one that never mentioned abortion, but instead covered any medical procedure on a minor when it passed the Assembly last spring. But that vote was nullified late last year when a Senate committee narrowed the proposed amendment to cover only pregnancy-related procedures.
The longer we wait, the more problems we have with children out there that are getting abortions without having family involvement.
So now, in order to make it to the ballot in November, both houses of the legislature will have to pass the amendment with a 3/5 supermajority. And there is plenty of support for the amendment. Polls say most Jerseyans are in favor.
But those supermajorities in both houses, predicted by Assembly Speaker Jack Collins right here on Due Process last January, have failed to materialize, at least so far. Sandy, curious that they haven't developed. I know because you had that curiosity, you called the Speaker's office. What'd you find out?
We didn't find out much. All we found out is that no vote is scheduled. And when we asked whether the Speaker still believed that that supermajority was available in both the Assembly and the Senate, we were told to not sure of exactly what the Speaker thinks on this. Very, very curious for an issue that seems to have huge support in the New Jersey populace. We read that 72% of New Jersey residents, whether or not they consider themselves pro-choice, like parental notification.
Now, Sandy, I think this supports my theory, which is that this issue belies the simplicity that its advocates suggest. That is, there are many women and men who are pro-choice, who in the polling results are in favor of parental notification. But I think many of those folks are ambiguous about their feelings. That ambiguity translates itself to the legislature, and the legislature really isn't as enthusiastic about this as it claims to be.
A 72% pro position does not strike me as ambivalent, and I'm frankly confused as to why this hasn't just again sailed through both houses, since we know that there is support in the legislature for parental notification.
Well, in fact, Sandy, the fact that it's bogged down is strong proof that that 72% contains some soft support, probably people who've realized that even though they're not opposed to parental notification, they're pro-choice people, and they think this issue is a stalking horse for the attack on the right to choose.
Of course, it leads us wondering then in November, when the people who support parental notification were very anxious to have this on the ballot to make the constitutional amendment happen, look likely to you?
Sandy, it seems to me they've had enough time to do it. If they haven't done it till now, they're probably not going to get it done. And my ambiguity theory will be something you'll have to grapple with next year when we have the same conversation.
There you go. So at one time, a resurrected parental notice law was looking like a slam dunk. But it wasn't this season's only sure thing to stall. On the national front, President Bush took office with a call for a change in the way we fund social service. And his so-called faith-based initiative had us wondering how it would all work here.
Thank you.
These after-school enrichment sessions are just one piece of the government-assisted programs run by St. Matthew AME Church, starting with a state and federal-sponsored Welfare to Work Job Training Center.
It's not in programs. You have to go into my document.
Making churches like St. Matthew a part of the effort to move welfare mothers into employment was allowed for in the 1996 federal overhaul of welfare and endorsed by a state initiative here in New Jersey, but only with some strict controls.
What we do here on our Neighborhood Improvement Development Association has nothing to do with what we do on Sunday morning with our Sunday school program. They're like apples and oranges.
The difference is that under the current system we have is that religious organizations provide the social services but cannot proselytize. Under Bush's initiative, proselytizing would be could be part of the services provided.
You will put your address and stuff up under there.
St. Matthew runs its social service programs under a separate community development corporation, housed in a separate building.
There's no mixture. We're a Christian based program in the sense that our principles are Christian-based as the people who run this program. But when you come here, we're not making you go to church.
The big question now, will all that change with a Bush initiative that may be looking more kindly on the merging of tax-supported social services with what churches are really all about?
Hello, Miss Murphy.
But while Bush may have thought he was playing to both the black church and the Bible Belt with his faith-based initiative, he's found himself facing resistance from both the left and the right. Sandy, what went wrong?
Well, firstly, yes, he thought he was going to make some points, no question, with the black church, as well as with the fundamentalist white church that was an important part of his base. Maybe part of the problem is that you can't please two such disparate groups who may have faith in common, but obviously have other very different approaches to social services.
But Sandy, it's also true that some of the more established churches have really also not been as favorable as the administration might have hoped. While, for example, the Bush administration has tried to reach out to the Catholic Church because of its gaffe in South Carolina, there has been some sense that the Catholic Church, which has worked out a way of dealing with the issue of faith and government funding for more than 50 years on the national scale, and more recently here in New Jersey, isn't anxious to tinker with a formula that works, even if it can't proselytize.
Well, exactly. Catholic Charities and Salvation Army have received a huge amount of government money for a very long time, and they certainly had no reason to jump on this bandwagon. I think what he expected was that that fundamentalist church would feel that he had really done something for them, because for the first time you would be able to offer a prayer with the sandwich, and he thought that would appeal. And yet perhaps part of the problem is that on the right there was a feeling, well, maybe you're going to start looking at what our prayers should be. And on the left, you had civil libertarians warning that the whole question of separation of church and state was at stake.
Sandy, in addition to that, I'm not sure you can take the black church for granted. While there's been enthusiasm about the idea, there's very much of a wait-and-see attitude, partly because legislation hasn't been forthcoming yet because of the Congress, and also because DiIulio hasn't yet worked out all these problems we've talked about with a set of guidelines.
So what do you think is the likelihood, Raymond, that all of this eventually gets abandoned and we go back to the model that's been used here in Trenton and been used nationally, the old Catholic Charities, Salvation Army argument, or do we wind up with something like what President Bush proposed as a very important part of his program?
I think Bush is going to stick with this because I think it's been a big part of who he is and his campaign promises. I think he'd rather have the courts say no than abandon it, but it's become a much tougher fight than he anticipated.
Very controversial, and if you think faith-based funding proved to be controversial, well, it didn't begin to compare to the furor here that continued to rage over racial profiling. And it all reached fever pitch with those legislative hearings into profiling present and past.
One would take that that's who we're moving the drugs up. If all these, and I don't know if these arrests were all for drugs or what they were for, what the arrest was for.
Well, these are searches, not arrests.
These are searches?
Right.
More than 2 years after he was fired for justifying those searches, the former head of the state police was still defending a New Jersey policy that's become a national scandal.
We have the Justice Department saying, no, what you're doing is wrong.
Day 2 of state hearings into racial profiling, into who knew what and when, into why it wasn't stopped, and how long ago it started. The current superintendent is on record about that.
Now, as far as the state police and what it's done in the past, there were a lot of signs, and I think the signs were back. I mean, I can remember them being there in the early 70s.
In other words, according to Carson Dunbar, the problem of state police targeting black drivers didn't begin with the Whitman administration, but may go back at least 3 decades.
Gary Brandt, Brian Minkle.
And that's something former state officials have tended not to want to talk much about, with one prominent recent exception.
Should we or can we relax the war on drugs?
He was a first assistant attorney general under Brendan Byrne, then U.S. attorney for New Jersey. But it's his stint with Jim Florio as AG that he's talking about now. In a 23-page statement to the Senate committee members, backed up by more than 100 pages of exhibits. all designed to prove that there was an attempt to change the profiling picture, an attempt abandoned when he and Florio left office. Meanwhile, the committee, too, is concerned with profiling history, but the focus here goes back just a few years, and though Bob Del Tufo has not been called, it's the actions of a more recent Attorney General that may be at the heart of these proceedings.
Is it fair to say you believed you had the support of the Office of the Attorney General in the way you were conducting and handling the issue of racial profiling?
Yes, sir.
Was that the message you left with on May 20th, 1997, that they were okay and supportive of the state police?
Yes, sir.
And for a while, it looked like Peter Venero would be forced from the court, impeached by an assembly that seemed poised to strike, until the Speaker declared he would not call a vote. Of course, that didn't put an end to anything, though, Sandy, it may have saved Venero's seat on the court.
Well, it looks like, in fact, it has done that. At least we can be pretty sure that there is not going to be an impeachment. The efforts have been totally unsuccessful in that regard, although there's been almost a universal call for Venero's resignation. It's amazing to me, Raymond, how he has, the justice, managed to withstand that and not seem to budge at all on his determination to keep that seat.
Well, I can't imagine him resigning, because to resign would be to concede that those 500 instances in which he said, "I don't know," were tantamount to lies before the legislature under oath, and in a sense allow himself to be almost the exclusive poster child for profiling abuses in New Jersey. And I think that's too much for anybody to bear. So I can't imagine him doing anything but digging in. And it now means that he may very well survive, because by the time we get around to the issue of his reconfirmation, there'll be a new body in the legislature, and maybe these issues will have dissipated and lost some of their strength.
Of course, it was comfortable for a lot of folks, including, I think, the legislature, to hang everything on Venero, because we know that racial profiling has been a grand tradition here in New Jersey. And one of the things that perhaps may have been most shocking to most of the state is what came out in these hearings was not only what Venero did or didn't do, did or didn't say, but the fact that the state police themselves admit that racial profiling continues now.
Well, there's litigation underway. There is still some talk about legislation, but you're right. What happened here was the hearings focused so much on Venero that he became a lightning rod, and there wasn't much movement on substantive discussions about this problem. Now, there is something to be said for saying this is a problem with national scope, and it can't all be resolved in New Jersey, because despite the rhetoric of the last presidential campaign, it's not a New Jersey problem, it's a national one. But we've had a unique involvement in this state, and for the state to make no progress, and the Congress not to move, and for the White House perhaps to be ambivalent, leaves us wondering whether profiling is likely to remain a significant reality unattacked.
And on the national level, we see General Ashcroft saying, oh, racial profiling is a terrible thing. But what backs that up? And on the state level, although there's been all of this chest beating in the legislature, in fact, when the Black and Hispanic Caucus tried to get some, I think, relatively mild legislation through that would, for instance, make racial profiling a crime, no go.
Well, there's been a lot of ambiguity about this issue. There is certainly much of the African American community that's inflamed, another sizable segment of the rest of the population deeply concerned, and then other folks saying this is a way to really interfere with law enforcement. It's not an issue that warrants all this energy. So the question is there really a will in the body politic to make any changes, or will we hear nothing but rhetoric?
Well, you know, it also makes you wonder, with all of this talk, whether the people of New Jersey are really very interested in this issue. And that's something that I think is hard to gauge, because if you ask people in a poll, for instance, how do you feel about racial profiling? It is only the most extreme people who will say, I don't care about it. And yet you wonder how much it drives the way people really feel, and therefore the way their legislators respond.
It's interesting because really the print media, outside of its coverage of the hearings at which Venero testified, which got massive coverage, have not really stayed with the profiling issue for the last year. So it's likely that the steam is already coming out of broad-based public concern with this issue, and the question is whether there's enough momentum to make the real institutional changes that are going to be required.
So you wonder whether for much of New Jersey, racial profiling as an issue goes away?
Well, Sandy, by our next due process season, some of the issues we've covered this year may just be resolved, but profiling is not likely to be one of them.
It is one of the stories we will continue to follow through the rest of this season and the next. So we hope you'll stay with us each week for Due Process.
And before we close this special edition, we have some good news of our own to report. Sandy's done us proud again. For the second year in a row, she's won the coveted Best Feature Award from the New York Deadline Club for her coverage of race and the justice system here on Due Process. It's just one more reason you want to join us next week. Till then, for Sandy and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown. See you next time.
So who's allowed to get a tattoo? By New Jersey state law, it can be anyone who wants one.
How old were you when you got your first one?
I was 15 and I was stupid and I went to the first person that would tattoo me without asking for an ID.
They should pull aside and make their emergency call. But people today use cell phones like they are just leisure, and that's wrong. They're only for emergency.
We believe that as young women, we have the right to choose to terminate a pregnancy. And we know that the information is available to us to make that decision ourselves.
And when the president talks about funding faith-based, church-based social service programs, St. John's might be just the kind of place he has in mind.
Is it fair to say you believed you had the support of the Office of the Attorney General in the way you were conducting and handling the issue of racial profiling?
Yes, sir.
Was that the message you left with on May 20th, 1997, that they were okay and supportive of the state police?
Yes, sir.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual,